Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. I really appreciate it. All of us do who are on this side. But I want to ask a question, which is, why is Korea interesting? And I'm sure you've done this before, but like, why are you here?
안녕하세요. 팩트 카메라입니다. 장마가 시작이네요. 부디 큰 피해 없으시길 바랍니다. 금일 팩트 카메라는 미국에 계신 데이비드 강 교수님의 한국을 왜 주목해야만 하나에 대한 강의 영상을 알려드릴 건데요. 잠시 교수님 소개 후 시작하겠습니다. 데이비드 강 교수님은 UC 버클리에서 국제정치학 박사학위를 취득하셨으며 뉴욕타임스, 파이낸셜 타임스, 워싱턴 포스트 및 로스앤젤레스 타임즈에서 최고의 학술 저널 및 의견에 수많은 기사를 발표하셨고요. 미국 캘리포니아 대학교의 국제관계 및 비즈니스 교수로 국제관계학부와 마샬 경영대학원에서 모두 임명되었으며 한국학연구소와 동아시아 센터 소장이시고 한국을 제대로 알리시기 위해 강의를 많이 하시는 분입니다. 그럼 같이 보시죠.
Right? I mean, and the thing is, of course, every country is important, every region is interesting. So in some ways, the question is, why would you take some time out for Korea, right? And my goal is not to give you all the facts, but rather to give you a sense of the contours of what Korea has gone through up until today. Because clearly, even if we spent a whole week, I wouldn't be able to do all the details of Korea. But I want you guys to take away some of the things that I find most interesting about why Korea is something worth studying, right? So we'll start. Like, why should anybody care in the first place? Right? Just in case you don't know where Korea is, you are here. Right? It's really small if you think about it, right? It's not in the center of anything. It's not in the center of Europe or in the center of Asia. It's way off on the side, way up north. But it is worth trying to figure out why it has been so geopolitically important. Korea is interesting geographically because there's a lot of things we say the most, the biggest, etc. in the world, but this is actually true. It's the only place in the world where the interests of the four major superpowers literally touch each other. And what I mean by that is, like, if you go to India or Iran or Iraq, USA is 10,000 miles away, Russia is 10,000, Here, Korea shares land borders with Russia and China. Its closest relation to Japan is 50 miles by ferry. And of course, as many of you know, the United States had at one time 100,000 troops and nuclear weapons on the peninsula. And now we have 30,000 troops. So the four biggest economies, the four biggest countries in the world are literally nose to nose on the Korean peninsula. And I'm not sure if you guys have heard this before, but you know how Italy looks like a boot? What does Korea look like? If you sort of squint, what does it look like? Raise your hand. Don't shout it out. In the back. Yeah, a rabbit. Wow, you guys are good. Did you hear this before? You already heard this. No, did you? Okay, where is it, right? Korea looks like a bunny, right? Here's the ears. Here's the little nose. Here's some paws, and here's some paws, right? Now, the interesting thing is that this is sort of traditionally, when I was growing up, this is what we said. But what it's come to be known sort of in international relations is like looking like a bunny, not that macho, right? Not manly enough. So Koreans will now tell you that it looks like a tiger. However, and this may not be politically correct, but I submit to you that is not what you would think of. You really have to squeeze the tiger to get it in there, right? I think it looks more like a bunny, frankly. But I will admit a tiger is more macho. So anyway, that's what Korea looks like. Now, how big is Korea? In general, as we know, we tend to think of China and Japan as huge, and Korea as really small. So one thing that we did, you can do, is you can take population and sort of landmass, the size in 1,000 square kilometers, and you put a bunch of Asian countries on there, and it looks sort of what you expect. Japan's big, 130 million people. Thailand, Philippines, South Korea, 45, 50 million people. Singapore is tiny, of course. It's a little city-state, about 4 million people. So yeah, right, there's some really big countries, there's some small countries. But in a way, that doesn't necessarily tell us that much about it. One of the interesting things we can do is what if we picked up Korea, if we picked it up and we put it in Europe? How big would it be? Because in general, we tend to think of European countries as big and a lot of these Asian countries as small. So we did the same thing, population and landmass. What's interesting about this chart? I mean, the first thing I would say is Japan is huge, right? With 130 million people, Japan is almost twice the population of Italy, France, UK. Japan is a huge country if we put it in Europe. And a unified Korea would be roughly the same size as all the European countries, 75, 80 million people. And a land mass roughly the same. It's not like UK, Germany, and Italy are over here and Korea's down there. I mean, Korea is a big country if you put it in Europe. It's actually not that small, because we're used to thinking of Germany and France and whatever as being big, right? The problem for Korea, and frankly for Japan, is that this is a false map, because this is really what East Asia looks like. That's Japan down there. That's Thailand. Korea is the 48, right? South Korea. China is huge. China is a continent-sized country. So of course, compared to China, everybody's small. It's the same way as the United States, right? We are a continent-sized country. Right? So European countries would all be clustered around there, and the US is here. But it's just to give you a sense of the scale, right? For most countries that aren't continent-sized, Korea is actually pretty normal-sized. It's not that small. Now, why also do we care? This is a chart, and I don't have too many charts, but I think this is very interesting. One way we compare is economic development. We all know that Korea, how many of you have a Samsung or an LG phone, TV, etc., Hyundai car, right? Korea's had an economic miracle in many ways. It's one of the things when I teach my undergrads or my MBA class that we spend time on. How did they grow so fast? But this chart is particularly vivid, because it's not just are we richer than we were before, because every country is basically richer than they were before. No matter how poor they are, cell phones didn't exist, and now you've got people in the poorest of countries who can actually buy a cell phone, right? So they're better off than they were. But often we want to measure, are you catching up to the richest countries, or in this case, the United States? So what this does here is puts economic wealth, per person income, GDP per capita, gross domestic product per capita, or wealth per person, as a percentage of American wealth per person. Okay, so you guys got that, right? If you go back to 1950, the red is Mexico and the blue is Brazil. 15% as rich. So every Mexican was about 25% as rich as every American per person. You watch over a generation, by the 1980s, Mexico had risen to 35%. They were beginning to catch up. However, that was short-lived. And so by 2005, 2004, Mexico is basically per person as rich as it was 50 years ago. So yeah, Mexicans today are richer than they were yesterday. Brazilians were at 15%, now they're at 20%, right? But they're not really closing the gap in terms of wealth compared to the United States. The United States is getting richer just as they're getting richer. And sadly, this is the case for most countries around the world outside of Europe. Africa, Latin America, Middle East, many South Asian countries. So why are Korea, Taiwan, these kind of countries so interesting? They started out, green is Taiwan, yellow is Korea. They started out at 10% as rich, 1/10 as rich per person as America in 1950. But rather than a sort of up and down thing, it's almost a direct line upwards. So that by 2004, they're over 50% as rich as the United States. And they've continued to close the gap. These numbers just haven't been updated. So these are countries that have truly closed the gap compared to the United States in terms of economic development. And you can see that if you ever go to Seoul, if anyone goes to Korea, Japan, Taiwan, these countries in many ways are more sophisticated, more technologically intense than American countries. Yes?
Is this unified
No, this is just South Korea. We're going to talk about North Korea later because North Korea has not closed the gap. But the South Korean economy, right? So we have the world's largest shipbuilder is Hyundai, or South Korea, and Hyundai Heavy Industries, right? Samsung and LG are now global brands. So in many ways, we know South Korean companies. They've managed to transform themselves in ways. Why it's an interesting story? Because this is truly amazing what the East Asian countries have done, particularly South Korea and Taiwan. How did they do this? How did they catch up and nobody else caught up? But here's Korea in 1905. This is the King's Palace. This is called Gwanghwamun. It's the main gate to go. How many of you guys have been to Korea? Oh, okay, good number of you. Okay. Have you seen this palace? I mean, this gate? They're fixing it up right now. They're restoring it, right? But this was the main road. The King's Palace is right behind here. It's got good feng shui because there's a mountain in the back, south-facing, water. There's a river right here, Cheonggyecheon, right? Oh, sort of the alignment, the geographic alignment of the energy, of the energy of the world. Yeah. I should not have said that because I have no idea what I'm talking about. Other than that, I don't know anything about feng shui. Or in Korean, they call it pungsu. Well, this was Korea, right? And a bunch of indigenous Koreans running around, right? This looks like Korea. Well, in 1905, and then formally in 1910, Japan colonized Korea. They formally took it over and annexed it so that Korea no longer existed. Now, you're going to hear a lot about this, I think, both in these classes or if you read about Korea. So I'm not going to say a whole lot here, other than to say from 1910 to 1945 is a period that many Koreans remember or learn about as being extraordinarily harsh. The Japanese came in, there was repression. Over time, they were forced to learn Japanese and were forced to not use their own Korean names. You had to choose a Japanese name. My father was born at that time, so he's fluent in Japanese, right? And they all when they took Japanese names, he said they all tried to use ones that were sort of similar to the Korean name, right? So a lot of internal resistance, but it was a very, very difficult time. And obviously for Koreans, who had been a strong, proud country, proud of their accomplishments, for literally unified since the 6th century AD, is extraordinarily humiliating. And the best example I can give that to you, this is the King's Palace. And what the Japanese did, in the center of that palace, is build their administrative building right over the top. So here's that same picture. This is the only one I could find. Had I known better, I would have taken pictures when I was there, right? So here is that same Gwanghwamun. And here is the Japanese Imperial Administration building. There can't be a more insulting thing that you do than to put down your building right in front. Even more than that, if you look at it from the top, and I wasn't able to find a picture of this, if you looked at that building from the top, it was written in the Japanese character of sun for Japan. So the building is built as sort of like the Japanese character for Japan. Extraordinarily humiliating, you can imagine, right? If there was, and again, the example, of course, if in DC in front of the Washington Monument, the Soviets built a big onion dome thing, right? It'd be. Now, the reason that many of you can't see it today is finally, a couple of years ago, they decided to tear down this building. And they're restoring the palace to what it looked like before, right? So here's another view from the other side of what that palace looked like, and here's the building, right? So it was an extraordinarily difficult time for Koreans. Many came to either China or the United States. Some tried to fight guerrilla, off in the wilderness of Manchuria they tried to fight. Here at USC, we have one of the famous Korean independence activists. We have the house that his family lived in, An Chang-ho. He wrote the Korean national anthem, Dong-hae Baba, right? But he was living here in LA for 20 years as he went to try and fight for independence. So it was a very difficult time. Well, after that, you get independence in 1945, but immediate division of the peninsula into North and South, right? It was decided in around 1943 by the US and the Soviet Union at the, I think, Malta conference. Stalin and Roosevelt are sitting around with Churchill, and they say, what are we going to do? Let's divide up Germany. to make sure that Germany doesn't fight again. Let's divide up the Korean peninsula. You take the northern half, Soviets. I'll take the southern half. We'll demobilize the Japanese troops. Now, the interesting thing about this is, and I'll just briefly talk about this, is this has never all made that much sense to me. I mean, I understand why. The Americans did not want to let the Soviets have the entire peninsula because it's geopolitically important. Why the Soviets agreed to a division is sort of surprising. But even beyond that, this doesn't make any sense to me. We divided up Germany because they started a war. So why didn't we divide up Japan? Right? Why did we divide up Korea and not Japan? The Japanese and Russians had